On a calm afternoon in the garden of his mansion, a millionaire businessman came home and was faced with a blood-chilling scene. The gardener's daughter secretly offering a strange liquid to his 6-year-old son in a wheelchair. The bottle bore a skull symbol, indicating extreme danger. In absolute panic, he was about to call the police. But when his son did something impossible, his world collapsed. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the mansion's gardens, a spectacle of perfection that Richard, in another time, would have savored. Award-winning roses, whose sweet perfume drifted on the air, lined immaculate flower beds, and the deep green lawn looked like a carpet woven by divine hands. But for Richard Sterling, that beauty was merely a silent backdrop to the quiet tragedy unfolding in his life. He, a man who had built an empire, whose fortune was whispered about in society pages and whose decisions on Wall Street could alter the fate of companies, felt like the most powerless of mortals. All his money, his assets, and his vast estate could not buy what he desired most: a cure for his son. He'd come home earlier than usual, a deep unease having pulled him from the Manhattan skyscraper where his business empire thrived. He was walking silently across the marble terrace, his Italian leather shoes making no sound, when his eyes fell upon the scene that would make his heart stop. There, near the old oak tree, was Leo, his 6-year-old son, in his wheelchair. Beside him, crouching, was Lena, the gardener's daughter, a small girl of the same age with large, serious eyes. The scene would have been tender, the image of a pure friendship blooming in the midst of pain, were it not for the object in the girl's hands. It was a small, dark glass vial, and etched on its label, unmistakable and terrifying, was the symbol of a skull and crossbones. Poison. The air fled Richard's lungs. A sharp ringing filled his ears, drowning out the birdsong and the whisper of the wind. His mind, accustomed to analyzing complex investment spreadsheets and cash flows, short-circuited. He saw, in slow motion, little Lena uncap the vial and lift it to his son's lips. Leo, his Leo, who trusted everyone with an innocence life had not yet stolen, opened his mouth obediently. Richard's world shrank to that single gesture, to that drop of dark liquid about to seal a fate he had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to reverse. Guilt, his constant companion since the accident that had paralyzed the boy, stabbed him with renewed ferocity. He had failed again. In his own home, under his own roof, his son was under attack. He thought of Valeria, his wife, the woman who had rescued him from the darkness after losing Helena. Valeria, always so careful, so dedicated to Leo's medical routine. She would be devastated. The idea of calling the police, of screaming, of doing anything, fought against the paralysis that had seized him. Why would this girl do this? Revenge, madness. She was the daughter of a loyal employee. It made no sense. Logic, the pillar of his life and his wealth, crumbled to dust. All he could think of was the liquid, the skull, his son's open mouth. With a roar that tore from his throat, he finally moved, propelled by a primal panic. He sprinted across the lawn, stumbling over his own feet, desperation giving him a speed he didn't know he possessed. "No!" he screamed, the word exploding into the serene afternoon air. He was only a few feet away, his arm outstretched to snatch the vial from the girl's hands. Terror transformed into blind fury. Lena startled, her eyes wide, but she didn't drop the vial. Leo looked up at his father, his pale face a mask of confusion. Richard was about to reach them, the scream still echoing in his mind, when something brought him to an abrupt halt. It wasn't a sound or a word, it was a movement, an impossible movement. He lowered his eyes to Leo's legs, inert for 2 years, and saw them tremble. Then, with a sudden, clumsy spasm, the boy's right leg kicked forward, striking the wheelchair's wheel with a dull thud. Richard froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind short-circuiting, unable to reconcile the poison in one hand and the miracle he had just witnessed. Time seemed to stretch and contract. Leo's kick, weak and uncontrolled, was like a thunderclap in the silence of Richard's heart. He stood there, paralyzed, his mind a storm of impossibilities. Poison and life, the skull and the movement. Nothing made sense. He lowered his gaze to Lena's frightened face. The fury that had consumed him seconds before dissipated, replaced by a confusion so profound it left him breathless. In a voice thick with emotion, a hoarse whisper that barely escaped his lips, he asked, not the girl, but the universe, What did you do?" Lena, with tears welling in the corners of her eyes, lifted her chin with a courage that belied her small frame. "Mr. Sterling, actually, your wife doesn't let your son walk," she said, the words tumbling out as if she feared being interrupted. "This is the medicine that makes him better. She hid it and made it look like poison." The accusation was so monstrous, so absurd, that Richard's first reaction was disbelief. A child's fantasy, a fabrication. Valeria, his Valeria, the angel who had saved him from depression, who cared for Leo with a devotion that bordered on sacred. Impossible. He opened his mouth to scold the girl, to tell her she didn't know what she was talking about, but the words died before they were born, like a flash of lightning. Fragments of past conversations flooded his memory. He remembered all the times he'd suggested seeking a second opinion, a specialist overseas, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. And Valeria, with her gentle logic and her soft touch on his arm, had always dissuaded him. "My love, we can't create false hope for him," she'd say. "The doctors were clear. Acceptance is the first step to helping him live a happy life." He remembered how she'd dismissed a renowned physical therapist who suggested an experimental therapy, claiming it would be too aggressive and traumatic for the boy. He, a titan of industry, a man whose instincts for detecting lies and traps had earned him a fortune in stocks and investments, felt like a fool. He had handed over the management of his son's health, his most precious asset, to her without question. Blinded by gratitude and grief, he had accepted the diagnosis as a final sentence. Now, the words of a 6-year-old were shaking the foundations of his reality. He crouched down, getting on Lena's level, and took the vial from her trembling hand. "Where did you find this, sweetie? Why do you say it's the medicine that cures?" Lena sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I saw her, Aunt Valeria. She keeps the box with this ugly drawing way in the back of the closet, and the other box with the sleepy legs medicine she leaves on the table. One day, I heard her on the phone saying that the skull medicine could never get near Leo. At that moment, the soft sound of footsteps on the grass reached them. "Richard, darling, what's going on here?" Valeria's voice was melody, the very picture of calm concern. She approached with her radiant smile, her perfect blonde hair, the image of the trophy wife everyone envied. Her eyes moved from Richard, crouched on the grass, to Leo, who was staring at his own leg with an expression of astonishment, and finally to Lena, small and scared. Valeria's smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw the vial in Richard's hand. It was an almost imperceptible twitch, but to Richard, whose senses were now on high alert, it was a confession. He stood up, hiding the vial behind his back, his heart beating erratically. He looked at her face, the face he had loved, and for the first time, beneath the mask of perfection, he saw a crack. He needed time. He needed to think. He needed to protect his son. And he knew that from that instant on, he was in a dangerous game where one wrong move could destroy everything. Valeria's smile recomposed itself so quickly that Richard almost doubted what he'd seen. She drew closer, the floral scent of her perfume enveloping him, a fragrance that once brought him comfort but now felt suffocating. "Darling, you look pale. "And you, Lena, why are you crying?" Her voice was pure silk, the concern perfectly staged. She reached out to touch Leo's arm, but the boy, still dazed by the movement of his own leg, flinched instinctively. The gesture did not go unnoticed by Richard. "We were just talking," he said, his voice sounding strange and forced to his own ears. He felt the eyes of his wife and the little girl on him, a silent tribunal where he was both judge and the defendant of his own naivety. He had to get Leo and Lena out of there. He needed a safe space to understand the scope of what was happening. "I think Leo's tired. I'm taking him inside," Richard said, moving to push the wheelchair. "And Lena, your mother must be looking for you. You should go." Valeria frowned, a delicate crease of feigned concern. "But he's barely had any sun today. I was about to bring his snack out here." "He can rest for a bit and come back out later," Richard insisted, his voice gaining a firmness that surprised her. He looked at Lena and says, with an almost imperceptible nod, indicated she should leave. The girl got the message. With a final, frightened glance at Valeria, she turned and ran toward the small staff cottage at the back of the property. Valeria watched the girl run, an unreadable expression in her blue eyes. "That girl, always where she isn't wanted," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard. The seemingly harmless phrase sounded like a veiled threat. Richard pushed Leo's chair across the garden, feeling Valeria's gaze boring into his back. Every step was heavy, every foot of ground covered, taking him further from the reality he had known and deeper into a nightmare. As he entered the mansion, the air seemed colder. He took Leo directly to the boy's room, a sanctuary of toys and books that suddenly felt like a gilded cage. He shut the door, the soft click sounding like the closing of a floodgate. Leo watched him in silence, his eyes full of a question he didn't yet know how to form. "Dad, my leg," the boy whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I know, champ, I saw," Richard replied, kneeling before him, the vial still clutched in his hand. He placed it on the dresser, out of Leo's reach, as if it were a radioactive artifact. "How do you feel?" Leo looked down at his own legs, as if they were foreign objects. "Tingly," he said. The simple word sent a wave of hope and terror through Richard. Tingly. It was a sign of life, of nerves reawakening. Proof that the paralysis might not be the death sentence he had been told it was. He knew what he had to do. He had to act fast, discreetly. He couldn't confront Valeria yet. If Lena was right, he was dealing with a woman capable of unimaginable cruelty. He needed proof, an ally. He thought of his personal physician, Dr. Albright, an older man he trusted. He would be the first call, but his hand hesitated as he reached for his phone. Valeria was charming, convincing. She had all the reports, all the scans, all the specialists on her side. What if she convinced everyone he was delusional, suffering from stress? The power and money he wielded could be used against him. He, the multimillionaire, the king of the capital markets, could be declared mentally unstable, unfit to make decisions. The fortune he'd built could become his own prison. He needed someone outside Valeria's circle of influence, someone who couldn't be bought or manipulated. That's when the image of an old face surfaced in his mind. Dr. Ramirez, a brilliant but reclusive neurologist who had abandoned clinical practice after a personal tragedy. He was the only chance, but finding him and convincing him would be the first of many hurdles. From outside the room, he heard Valeria's footsteps approaching down the hall. He slipped the vial into his pocket and forced a smile for his son. The game had begun. Night fell on the mansion like a heavy shroud, bringing with it a palpable tension. Dinner was a silent torture. Valeria, sensing the subtle shift in Richard's demeanor, redoubled her charm and attentiveness. She talked about vacation plans, about a new art investment she was considering, weaving a web of normalcy that Richard struggled not to tear apart. He responded in monosyllables, his mind miles away, drawing up plans, weighing risks. Every smile from her seemed a mask, every gentle touch an act of deception. He felt like an actor in a macabre play where the audience was himself and the prize was his son's life. The vial in his suit jacket pocket seemed to burn against his skin, a constant reminder of the monstrous truth he needed to uncover. While Valeria enthusiastically described the dividends from an investment fund she had suggested, Richard watched Leo. The boy was quiet, pushing food around his plate, but his eyes, every so often, would drift down to his own legs hidden beneath the table, as if expecting them to move again on their own. There was a glimmer there, a spark of hope Richard hadn't seen in 2 years. That spark was all that mattered. For that spark, he would risk his fortune, his reputation, everything. After putting Leo to bed, faking a headache to avoid Valeria's proximity, Richard locked himself in his study. The vast room, with its mahogany-paneled walls and shelves filled with books on economics and finance, had always been his sanctuary, the control center of his empire. Now, it felt like a prison cell. He sat in his leather chair, the city glittering outside, and began his search. Finding Dr. Ramirez wasn't easy. The neurologist had vanished from public life, leaving a legendary career behind. Richard called in favors, leveraged his network, and after hours of frantic searching, he got an address, a small clinic in a rundown neighborhood, nearly forgotten by the city. The second part was harder, convincing the man to help. He knew money wouldn't be the primary argument. Ramirez was a man of principle, driven by intellectual challenges, not wealth. Richard would have to present the case in a way that would pique the reclusive doctor's interest. He spent the rest of the night preparing, studying the few articles he could find on the most potent muscle relaxants, trying to understand how they could simulate paralysis. The more he read, the more terrible sense Lena's story made. The next morning, he told Valeria he had to handle an urgent problem with one of his international holdings, an excuse that would buy him the entire day. The lie came with a facility that frightened him. He was learning to play her game. Before leaving, he stopped by Leo's room. The boy was still asleep. Richard knelt by the bed and gently pulled back the blanket. He touched his son's leg, feeling the warmth, the life within. "I'm going to fix this, son. I promise," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. As he left, he passed Lena's mother, the housekeeper Maria, in the hallway. The woman, who had always been cordial, lowered her eyes and hurried past, avoiding his gaze. Richard saw the fear in her. Valeria must have already threatened her. His wife's network of control was wider and stronger than he had imagined. He wasn't just fighting one woman, but the fear she instilled in everyone around her. Dr. Ramirez's clinic was a modest building, squeezed between a bakery and a laundromat. Nothing indicated that one of the greatest neurological minds of his generation worked within. Richard took a deep breath. He, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, felt his palms sweat. He knocked on the door. After a long silence, the door creaked open, revealing a man with disheveled grey hair and piercing eyes that seemed to analyze his very soul. "Dr. Ramirez?" Richard asked. The man looked him up and down. "Depends on who's asking," he answered, his voice deep and weary. Richard held out a hand, clutching an envelope. "I don't want your money," the doctor said before Richard could even speak. "I know," Richard replied, lowering his hand. "I brought you something far more interesting, a puzzle, a boy with a spinal cord injury who, yesterday, kicked a ball for the first time in 2 years. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, a glint of professional interest finally cutting through the apathy. The door opened a little wider. The inside of Dr. Ramirez's clinic was a startling contrast to its worn facade. State-of-the-art medical equipment, though covered in a thin layer of dust, lined the walls of an immaculately white room. It was the sanctuary of a man who, though he had withdrawn from the world, had not abandoned his passion. Richard felt a sliver of hope. He was in the right place. For over an hour, He recounted everything, from Leo's supposed accident to the scene in the garden and Lena's words. He spoke of Valeria's evasiveness, her refusal to seek other opinions, the fear he saw in Maria's eyes. He handed the small vial to Ramirez, who examined it with the curiosity of a scientist discovering a new species. The doctor listened in silence, his face impassive, his fingers drumming on the metal table. When Richard finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Ramirez stood and walked to a window that overlooked a dead-end alley. "Central acting muscle relaxants," he said finally, his back to Richard. "In continuous, controlled doses, especially in a developing child, they could, theoretically, mimic the symptoms of flaccid paralysis. The muscle atrophy would be real, a product of disuse, which would fool most superficial exams, a diabolical plan, if true. It requires precise pharmacological knowledge and a complete absence of a conscience." He turned, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "Do you understand the implications of what you're asking me to do? If you're wrong, you're accusing your wife of a monstrosity with no proof. If you're right, you're putting your son and everyone around you in a danger you can barely imagine." "I know," Richard said, his voice firm. "But what I saw yesterday, my son's leg moving, that wasn't my imagination. And the only thing different about that day was that medicine." Ramirez picked up the vial. "I need to analyze this content, and I need to examine the boy, but I can't go to your house. It's too great a risk. If your wife is doing what you suspect, she monitors everyone and everything. The obstacle was clear. How could he get Leo out of the mansion for an examination without Valeria knowing? She controlled the boy's schedule with an iron fist, from his physical therapy to his lessons with a private tutor. Every minute of Leo's day was programmed. Richard thought of the vast fortune he possessed, the private jets, the luxury cars, the assets spread across the globe. None of those resources seemed useful now. The challenge was logistical, a matter of stealth and deception, not power or money. "I'll find a way," Richard promised, his mind already working on a plan. "I need 48 hours. "You have 24, Ramirez countered, his tone final. The compound in this vial could be an antidote or simply a placebo that coincided with a spontaneous recovery, however unlikely. But if the other substance, the one causing the paralysis, is administered again, it could mask any improvement. "Time is critical," Richard agreed. Leaving the clinic, the weight of the world on his shoulders, he called his right-hand man at the firm, Marcus, the only man he trusted implicitly. He concocted a story about a secret biotech investment that required the utmost discretion. "Marcus, I need a private ambulance. No logos, no official records, and a paramedic team that knows how to keep their mouths shut. They'll be paid generously, in Bitcoin if necessary, to leave no trail." The plan began to form. He would fake a medical emergency with Leo, a high fever, a seizure, something that would justify an immediate removal to a hospital, but not to a real hospital. To Ramirez's clinic. It was risky. Valeria, with her medical knowledge, might see through the charade. He would have to be convincing, would have to perform the panic of a desperate father with a perfection that would rival her own acting. Returning home late that afternoon, he found Valeria in the garden, supervising the gardener, Lena's father. She smiled when she saw him. "Darling, I'm so glad you're back. We had a little problem. It seems some of my jewelry has gone missing from my room, and the only person who was in there, besides the cleaning staff, was little Lena, who came to bring me flowers this morning." Richard felt his blood run cold. Valeria's counterattack had begun, and she was using the little girl, the only witness, as her first weapon. Valeria's accusation hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Richard looked at the gardener, an honest man named Alfonso, whose sun-weathered face contorted into a mask of shock and disbelief. He saw Lena, standing by her father's side, shrink as if she'd been struck. The cruelty of the attack was surgical. Valeria wasn't just discrediting the girl. She was destroying her family's reputation. ensuring that any word they spoke against her would be seen as the revenge of thieves caught red-handed. "That's absurd, Valeria," Richard said, his voice low and controlled, fighting to contain the rage rising in his throat. "Alfonso has been with us for years. His family is completely trustworthy." Valeria sighed, a theatrical sound of sorrow and disappointment. "I thought so too. My love, but the jewelry is gone. A diamond necklace and a pair of earrings you gave me. You know, the ones worth more than this family's entire net worth." The mention of monetary value was deliberate, a way to underscore the gravity of the accusation and the impossibility of restitution. She turned to Alfonso, the mask of sympathy giving way to an authoritarian chill. "I'm very sorry, Alfonso, but I'll need you to pack your things. I can't have people I don't trust living on my property and near my son." The words "my son" struck like a blow. She was claiming Leo, isolating Richard. "You can't do this," Alfonso protested, his voice trembling. "My daughter didn't take anything." "She's a child," Lena began to cry, a muffled sob against her father's leg. Richard knew that arguing there in front of everyone was a trap. Valeria would make him look like a naive husband, defending thieves against his loyal wife. He had to get them out of there, protect them. He placed a hand on Alfonso's shoulder. "Alfonso, please, just do as she asks for now. I'll sort this out, I promise." He looked into the man's eyes and tried to convey all of his sincerity and urgency. Alfonso, seeing something in his employer's gaze that went beyond the current situation, nodded slowly, defeat etched on his face. He took Lena's hand and walked toward their small house, a man who had just lost his job, his home, and his honor in a single stroke. Richard turned to Valeria, his face a mask of neutrality. "Are you sure about this, Valeria? An accusation like that?" "Of course I am, dear," she cut him off, her voice sweet again. "But don't worry, I won't call the police. I'll consider the matter closed. It was my error in judgment, trusting too much. Now, let's go inside. Dinner is almost ready." She walked away, leaving him alone in the twilight garden. The attack wasn't just on Lena, it was on him. Valeria was showing her power, her ability to manipulate reality and destroy lives with a word. She was isolating him, cutting off his potential allies. That night, Richard barely slept. The plan for the fake medical emergency now seemed 1,000 times riskier. Valeria was on high alert. If he failed, she wouldn't hesitate to use the mental instability narrative against him. The fortune he controlled, the businesses he led, could all be stripped from him, and worst of all, Leo would be left entirely under her control. He needed help from inside the house. His thoughts turned to Maria, the housekeeper and Lena's mother. She was terrified, but she was also a mother. If anyone could understand the desperation to protect a child, it would be her. The next day, he found her in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen from crying. He waited until they were alone. "Maria, I know what Valeria is doing," he said softly. "I know Lena didn't steal anything, and I know she's trying to help Leo." Maria froze, a dish towel slipping from her hands. The fear in her eyes warred with a flicker of hope. "Sir," she began, her voice a whisper. "She threatened you, didn't she? Threatened your family?" Maria nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. She said if I said anything, she'd have my husband arrested for something he didn't do, and that no one would ever believe us." "I believe you, Maria," Richard said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "And I need your help to save my son and to prove your daughter's innocence." Maria's fear was still visible, but now something else was there, the resolve of a cornered mother. She looked at Richard, at the man who had always been a distant employer, and saw a desperate father, an ally. She nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" The plan was dangerous, a choreography of deception where every step had to be perfectly executed. Maria, now a reluctant but determined ally, was the key. Her task was to create the initial distraction. The next morning, while Valeria was at her poolside yoga class, Maria would run to her in a panic, claiming the delivery from the organic farmer's market was spoiled and that she had to go to the store immediately for fresh ingredients for Leo's special lunch. A dish Valeria herself had demanded. It was a flimsy lie, but it appealed to Valeria's obsessive control over the boy's diet. While Valeria was gone, even for just an hour, it would be Richard's window. He would be in Leo's room, and at the right moment, he would fake the crisis. Richard spent the morning with his heart in his throat. He watched Valeria walk out to the garden, dressed in immaculate white workout clothes. Moments later, he saw Maria run toward her, gesticulating with the desperation of an award-winning actress. He held his breath. Valeria seemed annoyed at first, but the mention of Leo's food made her relent. He saw her grab her purse and head for the garage. The sound of her luxury car's engine fading away was the signal. "Now," he whispered into his phone, on the line with Marcus, who was waiting a few blocks away with the unmarked ambulance. He rushed to Leo's room. "Son, listen," he said, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "We're going to play a game, okay? You're going to pretend you have a very, very bad headache and you're very sleepy. No matter what happens, don't open your eyes until I say so." Leo, though confused, trusted his father implicitly. He nodded, his little face serious. Richard lifted his son into his arms, the small body feeling more fragile than ever. He laid him on the bed and began his own performance. He dialed Valeria's cell phone. "Valeria, it's Leo. He's not right. He had some kind of seizure. He's limp. He's not responding," he yelled into the phone, injecting all the panic he felt into his voice. On the other end, he heard the sound of screeching tires. "What? What do you mean? What happened?" Her voice was sharp, but Richard detected a note of calculation, not pure maternal panic. "I don't know. I called an ambulance. They're almost here," he lied, then hung up before she could ask more questions. Seconds later, Marcus's team, dressed as paramedics, rushed into the room with a gurney. They acted with cool efficiency, placing Leo on the stretcher and moving down the stairs. Richard followed, his face twisted into a mask of anguish. As they reached the front door, he saw Valeria's car speeding through the mansion gates. She hadn't gone to the market. She'd been waiting, watching. Richard's heart plummeted. The plan had failed. She would catch them. Valeria jumped out of the car before it had even fully stopped, running toward them. "Stop! What are you doing? Where are you taking him?" she shrieked. But just then, something unexpected happened. Leo, who was supposed to be feigning unconsciousness, opened his eyes. He looked at Valeria, his face pale, not from pretend sickness, but from a genuine fear. And then, in the clear, trembling voice of a child who has finally found the courage to speak a terrible secret, he said, "Daddy, I don't want Aunt Valeria's shot, the one that makes my legs fall asleep." The world stopped. The paramedics froze. Richard looked at Valeria, whose face transformed from feigned concern to an exposed, glacial fury. The veil had fallen. The confession had come not from a secret recording or a complex investigation, but from the mouth of his own son. And in the stunned silence that followed, Richard realized the game hadn't just changed. A war had just been declared. The silence that followed Leo's declaration was more deafening than any scream. The boy's words hung in the air, an undeniable and devastating truth. Valeria, for a split second, lost her composure entirely. Her blue eyes, normally so calculated, flashed with a pure, uncontrolled hatred. The mask of the devoted wife shattered, revealing the monster beneath. It was only an instant, but Richard saw it. He saw the truth in her face before she could even speak. She recovered quickly, forcing a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Richard, darling, what is this? What nonsense? He must be delirious, feverish." "I told you it wasn't a good idea to move him like this," she said, her voice trying to sound rational, but with a tremor of panic underneath. She moved toward the gurney, reaching out to touch Leo's forehead. But Richard stepped between them. "Don't touch him," Richard said, his voice low but carrying an authority she had never heard before. This was not the grieving, vulnerable husband speaking, but the ruthless billionaire who had built his empire from nothing. The power dynamic between them shifted in that instant, irrevocably. "Get him out of here," he ordered Marcus's team, who, snapping out of their stupor, quickly moved the gurney into the ambulance. "Richard, you can't do this," Valeria screamed, her hysteria now genuine. "You can't take him. I am legally responsible for his medical care." "You're having a nervous breakdown." She was already planting the seeds of the narrative she would use against him. The father driven mad by grief, but it was too late. Leo's confession, however she might try to discredit it, was a seed of doubt that, once planted, could not be removed. The ambulance pulled away, leaving the two of them alone in the mansion's driveway. The confrontation was inevitable. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Abandoning all pretense. I'm taking my son to see a real doctor," he replied, his gaze locked on hers. "One who isn't on your payroll." "You have no proof of anything," she spat. "Just the delusions of a sick child and the lies of a family of thieves that I, out of kindness, fired instead of calling the police." She was quick, articulate, turning every accusation against her into a weapon against him. "We'll see," was all Richard said. He turned and walked toward his own car. He had to get to Ramirez's clinic. Every minute Leo spent without a proper diagnosis was another minute of risk. He knew Valeria wouldn't stand idle. She would be calling her lawyers, her contacts, maybe even the police, claiming kidnapping. Her wealth, which was really his, would be used to create an insurmountable legal barrier. The drive to the clinic was the longest of his life. His phone rang incessantly. It was Valeria's lawyers, then the local chief of police, a man he knew attended his wife's charity galas. He ignored every call. When he arrived, he found Dr. Ramirez and his small team ready. They rushed Leo into the examination room, leaving Richard to wait in a small adjoining office. Time crawled. Every sound from the other side of the door made him jump. He paced back and forth, his mind a hive of worries. What if he was wrong? What if Leo really did have some rare condition and he was just causing the boy more trauma? The doubt was torture. Hours later, which felt like an eternity, the door opened. Dr. Ramirez entered, his face grim. In his hands, he held the results of a blood panel. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with your son's spinal cord," the doctor said, without preamble. "No sign of injury, old or new. He is perfectly healthy." A sob of relief and pain escaped Richard. Relief that his son was not permanently disabled, pain at the cruelty of what had been done to him. "But," Ramirez continued, his tone even graver, "we found traces of a long-acting barbiturate in his system, a powerful compound used in general anesthesia, and something else, something that shouldn't be there. A cardiotonic. In small, continuous doses, it's nearly undetectable. But the cumulative effect. Richard, whoever is doing this isn't just paralyzing your son. They are very slowly stopping his heart." The floor seemed to vanish from under Richard's feet. The truth was infinitely worse than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't about control. It was about inheritance. She didn't just want Leo in a wheelchair. She wanted him out of the picture, permanently. Dr. Ramirez's revelation hit Richard with the force of a physical blow. He dropped into a chair, the air knocked from his lungs. The walls of the small office seeming to close in on him. Poison. The word echoed in his mind, a sinister, unceasing drumbeat. It was a malice so profound, so calculated, his brain refused to fully process it. He thought of all the times Valeria had personally prepared Leo's supplements, the colorful juices she insisted were essential for his health. He thought of her feigned devotion, the sweet smiles that masked the darkest intent. His son's suffering for the past 2 years wasn't chance, an accident of fate. It had been a meticulously planned torture, and the fortune he had built, the empire meant to be Leo's legacy, was the motive. She wanted it all, the entire inheritance, without the burden of an heir. "Is he going to be okay?" was the first thing Richard managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "We'll start a detoxification treatment immediately," Ramirez said. "He's young, he's strong. The chances of a full recovery are excellent, provided the substance is completely eliminated and he is not exposed to it again. The motor recovery will take time and intensive physical therapy, but the prognosis is good." A small wave of relief mixed with the sea of horror. Leo could be saved. That was the only thing that mattered. Everything else, the money, the business, the betrayal, was secondary. But to save Leo, he had to neutralize Valeria, and she was already on the move. As they spoke, Richard's phone vibrated with a notification from his lawyer. Valeria had filed an emergency petition with the court. The claim, Richard, suffering a stress-induced psychotic break, had abducted his own son from a safe treatment environment. She was demanding sole medical guardianship and a restraining order against him. "She's got a hearing for tomorrow morning," Richard said, showing the email to Ramirez. "She has reports from respected doctors backing up Leo's original diagnosis. She's going to paint me as a dangerous lunatic." "And she might succeed," Ramirez admitted grimly. "The legal system tends to trust established experts. We have the truth, but they have purchased credibility. We need more than just these lab results. We need irrefutable proof of her intent." The image of Lena, small and brave, returned to Richard's mind. The girl had said her mother. Maria had discovered the truth by accident. Maria was the key. She might have seen something, heard something, that linked Valeria directly to switching the medications. But Maria and her family had been fired, thrown out. He had no idea where they were. While Richard was strategizing how to find the housekeeper, his son, in a nearby room, was beginning to emerge from the chemical fog that had imprisoned him for 2 years. As the treatment began, small sensations returned, a tingling in his toes, an itch on his calf, and with the sensations came fragmented memories, confusing images, muffled sounds. He remembered being sleepy, always so sleepy. He remembered Aunt Valeria giving him a special juice before bed, a juice that tasted bitter, and he remembered something else. One night, shortly before his legs stopped working, he had woken up thirsty. He'd gone to the kitchen, limping slightly, and heard Valeria's voice coming from the study. She was on the phone. He didn't understand all the words, but a few stuck in his childish mind. Words like accident, dosage, and Helena. Helena was the name of his first mother, the mother who, he'd been told, had died in a terrible car crash. Later, when Richard went in to see his son, Leo was sitting up in bed, his gaze distant. "Dad," he said, his voice small, "did Aunt Valeria hurt Mommy Helena?" "Two." The innocent question struck Richard with a force 1,000 times greater than the revelation of Leo's poisoning. The room spun. Helena, his beloved Helena. Her death had been so sudden, so devastating. An inexplicable accident on an empty road. But what if it hadn't been an accident? Valeria, at the time, had been Helena's private nurse, hired to help her recover from a lingering pneumonia. She was there, the day of the crash. She had consoled him, supported him, and months later filled the void in his life. The web of deceit was older, deeper, and more monstrous than he had ever dared to dream. He wasn't just fighting for his son's life, but for justice for his late wife. The war had become personal on a level that fractured his soul. The suspicion about Helena's death lodged itself in Richard's heart like a shard of glass. Suddenly, the past reconfigured in his mind. Every memory of Valeria now tainted by a terrifying doubt. Helena's pneumonia that never improved, despite treatments. The way Valeria The attentive nurse had made herself indispensable, isolating Helena from old friends. The crash, where Helena's car had veered off the road for no apparent reason, no skid marks, as if she'd simply fallen asleep at the wheel. At the time, doctors had attributed it to a possible late complication from her illness, a sudden weakness. Now that explanation seemed horrifyingly naive. Richard felt a wave of nausea. If Valeria was capable of poisoning a child for money, she was certainly capable of eliminating a sick woman to take her place. He had to fight on two fronts: protect Leo from the impending legal battle and secretly investigate Helena's death. The second task was the most delicate. Any false move would alert Valeria that he suspected something even bigger, and her reaction would be unpredictable and dangerous. He contacted the one man who could conduct such an investigation without leaving a trace, a former intelligence agent who now ran an elite corporate security firm. The payment, a significant transfer in cryptocurrency to ensure anonymity, was made from Ramirez's clinic. The instructions were simple: re-examine everything about Helena's accident. The police report, the autopsy, the medical records, Valeria's life before she entered theirs. Meanwhile, the hearing loomed. Richard's lawyer warned him the situation was dire. Valeria had presented affidavits from two renowned physicians attesting to Leo's condition and Richard's emotional instability. Dr. Ramirez's report, from a doctor who hadn't practiced in a hospital for years, would be easily dismissed as the opinion of a quack. The only hope was Maria's testimony. Richard used all his resources to locate her. He discovered that her husband, Alfonso, had been arrested that very morning on a trumped-up theft charge from a former job, a setup clearly orchestrated by Valeria to silence the family for good. Maria was in hiding, terrified. Richard managed to get a message to her through an intermediary, begging her to testify, guaranteeing her the best legal protection for her husband. In the clinic room, Leo was making remarkable progress. The physical therapy, though painful, revealed the strength that still existed in his muscles. He could already stand with support, a feat that filled him with radiant pride. His memories, however, continued to surface in disturbing fragments. He told Richard about a special tea Valeria would give Helena every night, and about a day he overheard Valeria on the phone, laughing, saying that soon the treasure would be all hers. They were the memories of a 4-year-old, impressionistic and perhaps inaccurate, but together they painted a horrifying picture. The weight of guilt nearly crushed Richard. He had brought his wife's murderer into his home, handed her his son, his heart, his trust. His blindness had cost Leo years of suffering and perhaps Helena her life. The night before the hearing, Richard received a call from his investigator. "We've got something," the man said. "The nurse, Valeria, before she worked for you, she was a caregiver for 2 other wealthy, elderly men. Both died of natural causes and left her a considerable portion of their estates. In both cases, the original heirs contested but lost. And your wife's pneumonia, the drug cocktail found in her medical records, is unusual. Some of those medications, in combination, can induce cardiac arrest and mask the signs of other substances." The truth was emerging, but perhaps too late. The next morning, as he prepared for the hearing that could take his son from him forever, Richard received another call. It was an unknown number. A distorted electronic voice spoke only 7 words, but they were enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "Stay quiet, or the little girl disappears. Lena." Valeria had made her cruelest move yet. She had kidnapped the child who started it all, turning the key to Leo's freedom into a hostage. The threat against Lena was a gut punch. Richard hung up the phone, his hands trembling, his mind spinning in a vortex of panic and rage. Valeria had escalated the game to a level of cruelty he hadn't thought possible. She was no longer just defending herself. She was attacking, using an innocent child's life as both a shield and a weapon. The choice she forced upon him was diabolical: save Lena or save his son. If he presented his evidence at the hearing, if he fought, the girl's life was at risk. If he backed down, he would lose custody of Leo, handing him back to his tormentor. He looked out the clinic window at the waking city and felt completely trapped. His immense fortune, his contacts, his power, it all seemed useless against his wife's pure, unscrupulous malice. He knew he couldn't involve the local police. The call from the police chief days earlier was clear proof of Valeria's influence there. They might slow-walk the investigation, get lost in red tape, or worse, tip her off, giving her time to harm Lena. He was on his own. His first instinct was to call Maria, but he stopped himself. The woman was already devastated by her husband's arrest. News of her daughter's kidnapping would destroy her. Besides, he couldn't be sure her lines weren't tapped. Every move had to be calculated. He called Dr. Ramirez and his private investigator into an emergency meeting. The room, which hours before had been a center of hope, became a war room. "She's forcing me to lose the hearing," Richard said, his voice tense. "If I stand down, maybe I buy time to find Lena. Or maybe she makes the girl disappear forever and uses her court victory to isolate Leo for good," countered the investigator, a pragmatic man named Jonas. "This woman doesn't play for a draw. She plays to annihilate." Dr. Ramirez, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "There is a third option. Pretend to capitulate, but use that time to turn the tables on her." The plan began to form. Richard would go to the hearing and not contest Valeria's petition. He would present himself as a confused, exhausted father, accepting the court's decision for Leo's sake. It would be the performance of his life, swallowing his pride and pain to appear weak and defeated. This would make Valeria drop her guard, feel victorious and safe. Meanwhile, Jonas and his team would use every high-tech surveillance resource to locate Lena. They wouldn't look for the girl, but for Valeria's accomplices. An operation like this couldn't be a one-woman job. She'd need help holding a child captive. They would track her finances, her communications, the movements of known associates from her dark past. The second part of the plan was even riskier. They needed a confession. With Leo legally in Valeria's custody, she would take him back to the mansion. Richard knew she would try to resume the medication as soon as possible to reverse the boy's progress. And therein lay the trap. Ramirez prepared a dose of a harmless placebo, the same color and consistency as the muscle relaxant C, and placed it in a syringe identical to the one Valeria used. The challenge was making the switch. The only person who could do it was Maria. Richard contacted her through a secure channel. The news about Lena sent her into shock, but her despair morphed into a cold fury. "I'll get inside that house," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "I'll tell her I'll do anything to get my husband and daughter back. She'll believe it. She loves to watch people grovel." The plan was that after the hearing, Maria would beg for her job back. Once inside, her mission was to find Leo's medication and swap the poison for the placebo. Meanwhile, the house would be secretly bugged with microphones and cameras by a technician from Jonas's team, who would enter disguised as an exterminator, a routine visit Valeria wouldn't question in her moment of triumph. Richard would have to watch, helpless, as his son went back into the cage, trusting that his team and a desperate mother could weave the net that would ensnare her. The climax was approaching, and the stage was his own home. The hearing was a painful charade. Richard sat in the polished wooden chair, his shoulders slumped in a performance of defeat, and listened as Valeria's lawyers painted him as an unhinged man, broken by grief, a danger to himself and the son he loved. He didn't fight back. He didn't present Dr. Ramirez's evidence. He accepted the judge's ruling granting Valeria temporary medical guardianship of Leo with a coldness that cost him every ounce of self-control. Valeria, across the courtroom, could barely contain her triumphant smirk. To her, The war was over. She had won. Richard saw in her eyes the certainty that he was, once again, the fool she could manipulate at will. It was exactly what he wanted her to think. Leo's return to the mansion was the hardest moment of Richard's life. He handed his son, who looked at him with terrified trust, into the arms of the woman who was poisoning him. "Be brave, champ. Remember our game," he whispered in Leo's ear. A code only the two of them understood. Valeria watched the scene with ill-disguised glee. Soon after, as planned, Maria arrived at the mansion, her face etched with pain. She threw herself at Valeria's feet, begging for her job, promising loyalty, saying she would do anything to help free her husband and find her daughter. Valeria's arrogance was her undoing. Flattered by the submission, she rehired Maria, seeing her as just another pawn on her board. The first part of the trap was set. Richard didn't go home. He set up in a hotel suite transformed into a high-tech command center. Jonas and his team had done flawless work. Screens showed multiple angles of the mansion, and the crystal-clear audio picked up the slightest whisper. He watched, his heart a knot of ice, as Maria, with trembling hands but a resolute face, managed to get into the medicine cabinet and swap the syringe Valeria had prepared for the one containing the placebo. Now, it was all up to Leo. The second part of the trap was about to spring. Richard spoke into a microphone. His voice transmitted through a tiny earpiece hidden in Leo's teddy bear. "Now, son, it's game time." On the screen, he saw his son, sitting in his wheelchair, call out for Valeria. She entered the room, a condescending smile on her lips. "What is it, dear? Time for your medicine so you can feel better." "I don't want it," Leo said, his voice small but firm. "My legs are waking up. Dad said I'm going to walk again." Valeria laughed, a joyless sound. "Oh, sweetie, your father is sick. He doesn't know what he's saying. You need me to take care of you. Without my care, you will never leave this chair." It was starting. Richard held his breath. "Did you make Mommy Helena sick too?" Leo asked. The line they had rehearsed, the final bait. Valeria's smile vanished. She moved closer, her face twisting into a rage she no longer bothered to hide. "Your mother was a weak fool, just like your father," she hissed, her voice low and venomous, unaware that every word was being recorded. "She didn't deserve this house, this wealth, this power. I did, and I took it. And now, all of this will be mine. You will stay quietly in that chair, taking your medicine, until your weak little heart decides to stop beating, just like hers did, and no one will ever know." She raised the syringe. But in that moment, Leo, driven by a primal fear and a strength he didn't know he had, pushed the nightstand with his legs. The table toppled, sending a glass of water crashing to the floor. The movement was unmistakable, too strong to be a spasm. Valeria's eyes widened, the confession forgotten, suspicion taking hold. She looked from Leo's legs to the syringe in her hand, and then to the teddy bear on the bed. Her face became a mask of comprehension and murderous fury. She lunged at the boy, no longer with the syringe, but with her bare hands. The exact moment Valeria lunged for Leo, the bedroom door burst open. It wasn't the local police, but state troopers, led by a stone-faced detective who had been watching the live feed with Richard and Jonas. They moved in formation, weapons drawn, their actions swift and precise. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" the detective shouted. Valeria froze, her hand inches from Leo's throat. The shock on her face was replaced by an animalistic desperation. She looked from the guns to the teddy bear on the bed and understood the full scope of the trap she had walked into. Her arrogance, her belief in her own invincibility, had blinded her. She had confessed to everything, loud and clear, for a world that was now listening. Richard didn't wait. The instant he saw his son was safe, he was already sprinting out of the hotel, the engine of his car roaring to life. He drove as he never had before, adrenaline drowning out the torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. When he arrived at the mansion, the scene was surreal. Police cruisers flashed silently in the driveway, and Valeria, handcuffed, was being led to one of the cars. She saw him, and her eyes, once full of hate, now held only the void of defeat. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The recordings were irrefutable. Richard walked past her without a glance and ran inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found Leo in his room, sitting on the bed, held by Maria, both of them trembling. "Dad!" Leo cried out. Richard wrapped him in his arms, a hug that contained 2 years of pain, guilt, and fear. He held on to his son, feeling the small, warm body, the breath on his neck, the living proof that the nightmare was over. "You were so brave, champ, so brave," he whispered, his voice finally breaking. For the first time in years, he wept, not from sorrow, but from a relief so profound it was almost painful. He looked at Maria, whose silent tears were of gratitude and the terror of what her daughter had endured. "Lena," he said, his voice firm again. "We're going to find her." Jonas entered the room, phone to his ear. He listened for a moment, then looked at Richard. Her accomplices panicked when the troopers hit the house. They abandoned the location. "We have the address. A team is on the way." The wait that followed was excruciating. But less than an hour later, a cruiser returned to the mansion. From the back door stepped Lena, small and scared, but unharmed. She ran into Maria's arms, and mother and daughter clung to each other in a sob of relief. Alfonso, the gardener, was released that same afternoon. The false charges dropped. The family was reunited, their honor restored. Richard's first victory was complete. His son was safe, and the truth of his suffering revealed. He watched Leo, still weak but determined, take a few hesitant steps with the help of a physical therapist from Ramirez's team, and knew that physical healing was just a matter of time. The second victory came weeks later. The investigation into Helena's death was reopened. Valeria's recorded confession, combined with the evidence Jonas unearthed about her past and the exhumation of Helena's body, which revealed traces of the same slow-acting poison found in Leo, sealed her fate. Justice, though delayed, was served. His first wife's memory was honored, not as a victim of a tragic accident, but as a woman whose truth had finally come to light. The corrupt doctors and police officials Valeria had bought were also exposed and arrested. The web of corruption unraveled thread by thread. The mansion, once a stage for lies, began to be purified. But Richard's final victory would not be measured in court sentences or newspaper headlines. It would be built on the ruins of the family he lost, and with the bonds forged in the fire of this ordeal. 4 weeks after that terrible afternoon, the sun gilded the mansion's gardens with the same intensity, but everything was different. The air felt lighter, the scent of the roses sweeter. The sound that now filled the space was not tense silence, but laughter. Richard watched from the terrace, no longer a man tormented by guilt, but a father rediscovering joy. Before him, on the soft green lawn, Leo was running. He ran with legs that were still a bit clumsy, his coordination returning day by day. But he ran with the freedom of one released from an invisible prison. At his side, trying to keep up, was Lena, her dark hair flying, her face lit by a smile no longer shadowed by fear. The mansion, which had witnessed years of silent manipulation, was becoming a home. Richard had invited Alfonso, Maria, and Lena to continue living on the property, not as staff, but as part of the family. Alfonso tended to his beloved garden with renewed pride, and Maria managed the house with a loving efficiency that made it a haven of peace. They were the quiet guardians of the new life blooming there. Richard had learned the hardest lesson of his life. His vast fortune, the assets, the stocks, and his entire net worth hadn't protected him from betrayal. but they had given him the tools to fight for the truth. He discovered that true wealth wasn't held in vaults or digital wallets, but in the bonds of loyalty and courage. He, the tycoon who had blindly trusted the one who claimed to love him, discovered that true love sometimes comes disguised as danger, in a small vial with a skull on it, offered by the purest of hands. Leo, the boy who spent 2 years believing he was broken, learned that the cruelest chains are the ones we cannot see, but that the courage of a friend can break them. He held no bitterness. His childhood resilience was a source of awe for his father. His only scar was a premature wisdom, an understanding that not all smiles are kind. And Lena, the girl who risked everything to give a child poison, revealed herself to be the guardian angel who brought not just a physical cure, but truth and justice. She never saw herself as a hero, only as someone who couldn't stand by and watch something wrong happen. Her simplicity and bravery were a constant reminder to Richard of what truly mattered. That afternoon, Leo stumbled and fell on the grass. For an instant, Richard's heart seized, an echo of the old panic. But Leo didn't cry. He rolled over, laughing, and Lena tumbled down beside him, laughing too. Richard descended the terrace steps and joined them, lying down on the cool grass, the blue sky above. He looked at the two small faces, smudged with dirt and full of life, and felt a peace that no profit or dividend had ever given him. The road ahead would have its challenges. The emotional healing would be a long journey for all of them. But here, in the garden where the nightmare had begun, a new family had been born. A family forged not by blood, but by truth, courage, and a love that had proven stronger than the most elaborate of lies. The suffering had been immense, but the recovery had finally arrived. And under the afternoon sun, a father and son, alongside the little heroine who had saved them, were finally free.